So in thinking about identity development, I just want to introduce sort of some notions here that we're going to talk about as we go through the other segments. So as we wrap up this segment, I want you to be mindful of, when a person is born, we don't know the self that we're going to become. It evolves. It changes over time. And we're given all of these scripts, all of these rules about what does it mean to be masculine, what does it mean to be heterosexual, what does it mean to be gay. We get all of these notions, and there's a lot of mixed messages around this. Often a lot of negative messages about being a gay man. There's certainly this collective message, as I was saying earlier, about gay men still to this day being connected to being pedophiles, to being ill or sick in some way. And we often do that to people who tend to express sexuality as openly as gay men tend to do. We're a little bit scared of being expressive with our sexuality. And yet we know that there is a lot of health that can come from an acceptance of our sexual self. And sometimes when that's not what we know, it becomes scary for the dominant culture. So I just want you to be mindful that this is a developmental process, and this is something that happens over time, and there's certainly kind of a flow to this process that and an ebb where one's identity develops within the continuum of many things, cultures such as age and religion, ethnicity, gender expression, language, region, socioeconomic status, so on and so forth. All of these actually have an impact on the development of the self, and it certainly has an impact on the development of gay men and the gay male identity. Two names that you'll probably want to know is Vivian Cass, and I'm going to lose the first name, but Triadin is the last name. You'll see the references for both of them at the end of the reference list in the final segment. They really have been the authors that have written a lot about and have established some of the identity models that work really well often for gay men, although they don't always work as well for other groups in the LGBT community. And we know that as generations evolve and change over time, that we can't treat some of these things with rigidity, that there's a fluidity in identity development, as I was saying. So one of the things that I think is important for you to know is that oftentimes with gay men, there is a period of time, primarily because we're socialized, we're taught to be heteronormative, that being heterosexual is normal, and there isn't really any variance to that, or there shouldn't be. Those can be the messages that we get. So there's a period of time where we don't know. And so we see this in gay men, and that period of time can be anywhere, it could be as early as 6, maybe even younger. I have had a client, and certainly have had friends, who didn't truly become conscious and were able to admit on some level that they might be gay until they were in their 60s. And so this sort of pre-stage, this is what Cass calls it in her work, that this is a pre-stage, this sort of place of not knowing that one's sexual orientation is different than the heteronormative standards that we were given. Well, something comes along. We're just kind of bumping around in life and going through life, and, a fantasy pops up, or an attraction to another male comes along, and then we find ourselves with this new information that does not match our not knowing. A knowing happens. And so there's this recognition that there's this potentiality that I might be gay. When this happens, there's sort of this confusion that can occur. Can this be true? This is not what I was taught. What does this mean? If there's negative connotations, how can I be this if this is so negative and bad? If I was taught that this was a choice and I find myself here naturally, that creates a lot of confusion, and it disrupts the development of identity that's already occurred. And so in that disruption, though, is almost an avenue, a door. Now, one of these doors, there's actually a couple of doors that can happen, is that one may tend to avoid and run, and we can go into denial. We know defense mechanisms can be really strong. And so we may deny this knowledge that we've gained. And that can last for a long time. People can get really good at denying things that we don't want to know or that we don't want to believe. We know that's true. The other door is the beginning of exploration. And when one walks through that door, they may walk through that door with trepidation, and they may walk through that door with hope. There's probably often, more realistically, a mixture of both of those things. As one begins to explore, we start to develop a tolerance for being and identifying as gay. Now, tolerance does not mean acceptance. Tolerance is truly in the sense of, oh, I'll tolerate this. And I often have heard my clients, when they're in this place, they'll say things like, you know, I may be gay, but I'm not that gay. There's like this acceptance, like there's a level of gayness that is still considered evil or bad or wrong, because some of that internalized homophobia is still there, that internalized heterosexist, those heterosexist notions still live on. And so there's a tolerance that this may be my truth, but I'm going to draw a line with how far this goes because there's still something bad about it. But that tolerance, of course, leads naturally to more exploration, which then leads to, as we explore, we find that maybe these things aren't so bad. Maybe I actually can have a variation in my gender, and that's okay, in how I express myself. That my sexual orientation and my gender expression aren't married together. They're actually separate things. And I've been given rules about my gender expression that I don't necessarily have to follow anymore. And so this leads to more of an acceptance of self, a more genuine and authentic sense of self. Now, this isn't a complete acceptance. We're not talking about I've really got that identity down and I'm able to use that in a very fluid way. Because often what we find happens is that as that acceptance happens and we immerse ourselves further into the community, we find sort of this pendulum effect occurs, and that acceptance moves into this immersion. And it can even lead to a potential separation from the dominant culture. We saw that in the clone culture, where it's this sort of, we make our own communities, you're bad, we're good. It's almost like the ism shifts a bit here. And so this is often called a time of pride, where there's a true sense of, I embrace my community, I embrace, and often it may be only an embracing of the subgroup that you're a part of, the one that you fit in. We've certainly seen that in the bear community. We've certainly seen that when there's comparisons of how gay male youth may treat aged gay men, and as far as valuing and considering attractive and worth. So this pendulum effect is necessary. This whole movement, and you may actually find your clients really just sort of reporting all this immersion and this experience with a lot of pride, a lot of self-worth, a lot of a sense of almost a fight behind it. But what you'll find is there's almost this removal, this separation from identifying with some of the dominant pieces that are actually still part of them. So this isn't a true integration of self quite yet, but it's certainly further along the continuum in identity development. So this is probably a good time to say that you may go back and forth in this identity development. There may be things that push you back and pull you forward. You may sort of pendulum back and forth as you experience different things. And this sort of creates enough dissonance for you to recognize that we don't need to split. Basically, it's not all good, it's not all bad from either the dominant culture or the gay male culture. And what we find is that people begin to synthesize or integrate identity, where there's dominant pieces that are kept and there are pieces of being a gay male that are kept, and it becomes a part of your identity and not the total sum of your identity. So once again, Vivian and Cass are the persons that you should look at, Cass and Triadin. This concludes our brief introduction to some of the main topics we're going to talk about. These are going to be important elements that you need to know and keep in the back of your mind as you move forward, because we're going to refer back to these. I may refer back to subgroups and some of the language that we've used in the important terms. We're certainly going to refer back to identity development when we start applying theory to actual therapy. So I invite you, if any of these things have intrigued you, challenged you, maybe even if you felt some discomfort, take the time now before you move on to segment 2 to explore, to think about. Maybe in one of the discussion forums, maybe you want to post some dialogue there about this. Maybe this will be included in some of the discussion dialogues that you'll need to post in these segments. But while you have this break before you move forward, take the time to really integrate this information and synthesize it in your development as a clinician who's going to work with gay men.